Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Which CPU should you buy? A Ryzen 5 1600 or 1600X or one of the Intel i7-8700 or 8700K CPUs? This is going to be an in-depth look at the relative pros and cons of these processors, the motherboards and platforms that stand behind them, cooling options, who should consider each one, and whether or not you should upgrade from something older. Are these worth the money, or should you wait till next year for whatever may come from both AMD and Intel? First, please check the links in the video description below. The very first one is to the giveaway that we are currently running in the month of November when I'm publishing this video. 4 channels, 4 prizes, 4 winners, including 2 complete gaming PCs, one i7-8700K and one Ryzen 5 1600X, plus 2 more prizes. Check out the link in the description below. Be sure to enter. Also linked in the description below will be links to both Amazon and Newegg for all the CPUs and coolers that I'm going to talk about in this video. Please check those out. If this video was helpful to you in any way, please use those links when shopping. It really does make a difference. First, let me be completely clear up front. This is not one of those videos where there's 40 benchmarks and 10 minutes of nothing but charts. This is more of a practical real-world look at these CPUs and the relative value of them, because the Intel does cost more, but it's faster. Who should buy it, who shouldn't, who should just get the Ryzen, the value of the motherboards, and the value of various aftermarket coolers versus the ones that these CPUs come with. The video with 40 benchmarks will come in the future. I have all the tests run on both of the 2 i7s. I don't have an updated test run on the Ryzens yet, but I've been using the Ryzens all summer. I've got enough experience with them that I'm comfortable talking about that without having run my latest suite of benchmark tests on them. As far as the Intel chips go, I've done nothing but test those for the whole month of October since Coffee Lake launched. In fact, my test bench back there has an i7-8700K in it. It's what I've been using for all of my benchmark tests for the past month. I have another machine downstairs also with an i7-8700K that's actually built into a full tower that I've been using. I've done some live stream tests with it on Twitch. I've done a bunch of gaming with it. So I've now got enough time with this that I feel comfortable talking about its relative pros and cons and the experience with it. Let me also be clear. I've had the i7-8700K now on 6 different motherboards, both stock and overclocked, and I've had 5 different coolers on it. So again, I can talk about that experience, which I couldn't have done on launch day. I didn't have enough time to review it, but now we can get into it in detail. First, a quick recap of these processors. All 4 of the chips we're looking at today are 6-core, 12-thread processors. They can do 6 things at once and schedule 12. It helps with smoothness in games and multitasking, and it does add performance to certain tasks. But in general, they all have the same basic execution units. The difference is how fast they run, how much work they can do per second per core. Starting on the AMD side, the Ryzen 5 1600 out of the box has a max turbo speed of 3.6 GHz, and the 1600X has a max turbo speed of 4.0. Both of those processors will run 100 MHz faster on what's known as XFR auto overclocking. They are both unlocked, and you can manually overclock those processors to higher speeds than that if you want to. In fact, many people find that the 1600 is the better value. It comes with a cooler, we'll talk about coolers later, and frankly, it's more or less the same chip and should be overclockable to similar speeds of the 1600X. The difference is the 1600X gives you a higher out-of-the-box speed, no overclocking required, and it may be binned a bit better and you may get a little bit more overclocking out of it. You sort of get a guaranteed higher clock, whereas with the 1600, most of them can be overclocked really well, but there's no guarantees in life. It might or might not. On the Intel side, the i7-8700 has a max turbo speed of 4.6 out of the box. It has an all-core turbo speed of 4.3 out of the box. The i7-8700K has a max turbo speed of 4.7, only 100 MHz faster than the non-K chip. But most importantly, if you don't run it overclocked, its 6-core all-core turbo speed is 4.3, exactly the same as the non-K chip. If you do not plan to overclock, there is no point whatsoever in buying the K chip. Save your money and get the non-K chip. I have put both of these into machines. I have tested that. There's no effective performance difference in normal day-to-day use between the 2 i7s unless you're going to overclock. It's also worth noting that the non-K chip comes with a stock cooler. It's honestly not a very good stock cooler. Again, we'll talk about coolers in a minute, but it does at least come with one that you can in fact use. The K chip does not come with a stock cooler, and you'll have to buy one just like the X chip on the Ryzen side. Now note that when I talked about these CPUs, I'm talking about turbo speeds, not the base clocks. The reality is the base clock of these chips can be quite low. In fact, the non-K chip i7 has a 3.2 gigahertz base and a 4.6 gigahertz single core turbo. That is a huge spread. With appropriate cooling, not the stock cooler, and yes, I've tested it and it's pretty rough on the stock cooler, but with appropriate cooling, you absolutely get 4.3 gigahertz on the non-K chip all day long. So don't worry about the low base clocks. And that's true on the Ryzen side as well. All of these chips with appropriate cooling run at their turbo speeds just fine. Now that's all well and good. You say, great, there's a bunch of numbers and tech specs, but who should buy these? What are they for? What kind of use would you want to buy any of these chips for? Who needs a 6-core 12-thread chip anyway? Well, first of all, if you are a mid-level to premium user and you're ready for an upgrade, your current computer is getting to be a few years old, you want a little bit more performance, you want some more smoothness in either your multitasking or games, you want your videos to render a little faster, you want to be able to do more stuff with your machine, it may very well be time for an upgrade. Now, there's other things you can do with an older machine to get more performance or more smoothness. Sometimes a RAM upgrade is called for. Certainly a solid-state drive should be in there. If you're currently still using a desktop computer in 2017 without a solid-state boot drive, that's the first thing you need to fix, because these will not be that dramatic of an upgrade if you're still running from a hard drive. It's really time to move to an SSD. So make sure those things are in order before you look at the CPU. Your graphics card's important. If you're gaming and you've got a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old graphics card that's not cutting the mustard, getting a new CPU is not going to fix your gaming experience unless you also upgrade your graphics card. So keep that in mind when we talk about gaming performance. Speaking of gaming, let's be straight up blunt. If you want to play AAA games today, right now in 2017, and by AAA games, I mean the latest and greatest hardcore games, Call of Duty World War II, Battlefield 1, Mass Effect Andromeda, Ghost Recon Wildlands, do you need a 6-core chip? No, you don't. All of those games, in fact, play just fine on 4-core processors. Now, some of those games do struggle on a 4-core, 4-thread chip, the older i5s or the Ryzen 3s. But on an older i7, such as a 6700K or 7700K, or the new Ryzen 5 1500X, for example, which is 4 cores, 8 threads, which helps with the smoothness, all those games, in fact, play just fine. Don't worry about it. If you have a computer from the last 3 years and you've got 4 cores and 8 threads, either from the AMD or the Intel side, you absolutely can wait another year. We're going to have Coffee Lake and we're going to have this generation of Ryzen chips around for probably another 9 months or so. The dates are uncertain, but sometime next year in 2018, both Intel is going to release their Cannon Lake refresh, and then Ryzen is going to have Ryzen Plus. It's not Zen 2. Zen 2 is probably not till 2019, but they're going to have a small refresh of these. And so if you've got something from the past couple of years that's working for you, you might consider waiting till next year because there's always something new around the corner. On the other hand, are you still rocking an i5 2500K or i7 2600K? Yes, those still play current games just fine, but there really is a noticeable performance increase coming from machines that old, 5 to 6 years old. Yes, those can be overclocked. Yes, the raw benchmark charts and frame rates do show competitive performance to these chips, but it really isn't in the real world. I've played Ghost Recon Wildlands on my i7 2600K. It's overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz. It is not as smooth of an experience as it is on these chips. The average is almost as good. The benchmark chart looks good. It's not the same experience. And that's not something that necessarily shows up in a benchmark chart, but it does show up when you put the machines side by side and actually use them. If nothing else, take my word for it, because I have both of them. And frankly, this is a noticeable upgrade over an i7 2600K in modern 2017 games. Now you go back a couple of years and it's less of a noticeable difference, but in the very latest games, I am starting to see a real difference, and it is time to at least consider upgrading that if you want to play the newest releases. Of course, in any conversation about Should you upgrade? Is it worth upgrading? The reality is everybody's needs are different. You might very well have an i5-2400 machine from 6 years ago and say, it plays all the games just fine. I play World of Tanks, League of Legends, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and Overwatch, and what's the big fuss? It seems to run fine. And it does. Those games absolutely don't need these CPUs. Those games would run fine on a modern Ryzen 3. On an i3-8100. You don't need 6 cores, 12 threads to play those type of games. I call those games esports titles. Even Rainbow Six Siege plays just fine on those. The new Destiny 2 plays fine on a 4-core, 4-thread machine. These are for Call of Duty World War II, Battlefield 1, those kinds of games. The new Assassin's Creed Origins, for example, will play much better on these than they will an older 4-core processor. Live streaming games, on the other hand, is a completely different equation. Let me give you two modern current examples, Ghost Recon Wildlands and Star Wars Battlefront 2. Now, I've played the beta of Battlefront 2. The game itself hasn't actually released when I recorded this video, but it will be in a few days, and rest assured, I will be live streaming that. Now, downstairs for my streaming setup, I currently have an i7-8790K. That is an up to 4.4 gigahertz out-of-the-box CPU. It is an excellent, excellent processor. I have 32 gigabytes of DDR3 2400 megahertz RAM on that machine and a GeForce GTX 1080 Ti. Should run Ghost Recon Wildlands just fine, and it does if you're just playing the game. If I just sit down on that machine and play Ghost Recon Wildlands, it is smooth and completely playable. It does not stream very well at all. Those of you who follow me over on Twitch will have seen that experience. It was rough and choppy. I actually beat the game on the live stream. That's over on the Tech Deals Gaming channel. If you live stream Ghost Recon Wildlands on an i7-8700K, it's smooth. You need the extra cores, you need the extra threads for that game. Now, what about Star Wars Battlefront 2? That's also a brand new 2017 title. It must need this as well. No, it was completely and totally smooth on my i7-4790K, at least during the beta. Now, it was also, of course, completely smooth on the 8700K. I streamed it on both. Was it faster on the 8700K? Yes, but we're talking hundreds of frames per second versus hundreds of frames per second. So, yeah, it's frankly fine on either one. Whether you need this also depends upon which games you play, as much as what you're doing, whether you're live streaming and whether or not you're trying to play the latest and greatest games versus games from a couple years old. That's just two current 2017 games with two very different experiences. I would like to point out that if I had to pick between my current i7-4790K and a Ryzen 5 1600X for a game streaming machine, I would take the Ryzen 5 1600X, even though its total frame rate will be lower. The average FPS of the Ryzen 5 1600X will in fact be lower than an i7-4790K, but it will be smoother. It will be better at multitasking and better at live streaming. So it's worth considering that you would take a small average performance hit going from a 4790K to a Ryzen 5, but you get a better overall game streaming experience. That being said, if you currently have an i7K chip from the past 5 years, any of them, and you really want to upgrade, you really should go to an 8700K. You don't want to give up that per core, per frame performance because you'll gain in some areas and lose in others, and it's going to feel like a side grade. Now, if you have an older i5 processor of any vintage, then frankly, the Ryzen 5 1600X is awesome, and I highly recommend it. Just keep in mind that going from a 4+ gigahertz i7 older chip, it's kind of a trade-off to go to Ryzen just because of its lower per-core performance. That leads into an excellent conversation about how much faster the i7 is than the Ryzen 5. Now, first of all, clock speed is one factor, but per-core performance is another. So let me give you the short version. Ryzen 5 1600X with appropriate cooling will overclock to 4 GHz fixed on all 6 cores. i7-8700K with appropriate cooling will overclock to 5 GHz fixed on all 6 cores. Is it really that much faster? Yes. How much so? 30+% faster. It's not just 3 or 5 frames per second. I have seen 30 to 40 frames per second performance difference between a 5 GHz i7-8700K and a Ryzen 5 1600X at 4 GHz. Not only is 5 gigahertz faster than 4 gigahertz, but the per-core performance is faster. Furthermore, modern games are currently optimized and designed on Intel processors. Yes, Ryzen has now been out for about 7 or 8 months now, but let's be honest, games have a 2 to 3 year development window. Everything coming out this year was all developed and designed for the Intel architecture because this is just too new. True, Christmas 2018 and 2019 will see more games that better take advantage of the unique features and the architecture of the Ryzen chip. But you're not buying a CPU for 2 or 3 years from now, you're buying one for today. And the reality is today, the Intel chip is faster. But it costs more. I mean, if the price were the same, there'd be no conversation. Everybody would buy the Intel. But the truth of the matter is there is a not insignificant price difference. We'll talk about the price difference, the total platform, including motherboards and coolers, later in the video. But is the Intel worth it? Is all that extra performance, 20, 30 plus frames per second difference, sometimes 40 in some titles, is it worth the premium? That depends. As with everything in this video, it depends upon you. If you play games at 60 frames per second, if you have a 1080p, 1440p, or 4K monitor that's a 60 hertz monitor, that means the screen physically refreshes itself 60 times per second. Sure, you can turn VSync off and get 120 frames per second per the benchmarks, but your screen's not physically capable of displaying it. It just drops all the extra frames. If you turn VSync on to get rid of the horizontal tearing that you get when you have VSync turned off, well, then they both perform exactly the same. Either of these chips will run any current game at 60 plus frames per second with whatever graphics card those games may require. There's no issues whatsoever, and all the extra performance of the Intel chip is kind of left on the floor. Maybe it's future-proofed a little bit because you'll grow into it because it does in fact have more performance. It would be faster in live streaming a bit. It would be faster in video encoding, video editing a bit because it does in fact have more performance. But if you don't care about those things, Ryzen is a better value for the money. On the other hand, do you have a 100 Hz, 144, or 165 Hz panel? Do you want to play games at 100 plus frames per second? Are you a competitive online gamer that turns off VSync because you want the lowest possible input lag? Because VSync does introduce input lag. The i7-8700K is going to give you the best competitive gaming experience, the best greater than 100 frame per second gaming experience, but you need a lot of graphics card to do that. You either need to be playing esports titles, in which case you don't need an i7 in the first place. An i5 or even the i3K chip overclocked will give you hundreds of frames per second in any of those games. Or you need a 1080 Ti. To really make use of the i7-8700K, this is going to sound like a harsh statement. I truly believe that if you're going to spend the money on an i7-8700K and the money on a good motherboard, it doesn't have to be this. This is a nice motherboard, but it is a bit expensive. We'll talk about motherboards later. You really need to buy a GTX 1080 Ti if you're going to buy an i7-8700K. I really wouldn't put any other graphics card with it. And I completely understand that many people are going to say, well, that's overkill for 1080p gaming. Well, yes, but so is this CPU if you only care about 60 frames per second, because the Ryzen 5 1600 will do that just fine. The Ryzen 5 1600 will do that stock out of the box without even being overclocked. You really don't need that much CPU power to do 60 frames per second. You need graphics card power if it's a graphics intensive game. High frame rate requires lots of CPU power because in order to drive a game at 100 to 144 frames per second, regardless of your graphics, the CPU has to generate the world and process your input and handle collision detection and AI processing that much faster. And that's really where the Intel chips come into their own. So in my opinion, if you're going to spend $350 to $380 on a K chip, an i7-8700K, $200 on a motherboard, $100 on a high-end cooler to get 5 gigahertz, there's really nothing else to buy but a 1080 Ti. If, on the other hand, your graphics card budget is more in the GTX 1060, 1070, RX Vega 56, or perhaps even an RX 580, buy a Ryzen 5 1600. It goes much better with those. Here's another way to look at it. Generally, I believe you should spend twice as much on your graphics card as you do on your CPU for a gaming-focused computer. Now, this is not true if you're non-gaming, if you're productivity, general office tasks, etc. But for gaming, if you're going to spend $200 on your CPU, spend $400 on your graphics card. But if you're going to spend $400 on your CPU, Spend $800 on your graphics card. A 1080 Ti really is not overkill for this, even for 1080p gaming. One further division I'd like to make is the X chips and K chips versus the non-X and non-K chips. The real deal here, the value for the money, is the Ryzen 5 1600 and possibly the i7-8700 non-K chip. As I said before, the out-of-the-box turbo speed is 4.3 gigahertz. That is absolutely good enough for 100 plus frames per second gaming. 144 frames per second, especially in the latest titles, I'd want the K chip at 5 gigahertz. But 100, maybe 120 frames per second, the non-K chip does just fine. You can install that on a less expensive board. You don't need the highest end, fanciest boards. $100 to $150 is all the motherboard you need for the non-K chip. And you don't need to spend a lot on cooling. You can use the stock cooler if you want to. I don't recommend it. It does get very, very hot on the stock cooler. But you don't have to spend a lot on cooling. There's two specific coolers I'd like to recommend for the non-K chip over here. The first is the excellent Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo. This is $30 or less, and it absolutely provides all the cooling that you need for the non-K chip processor or the K chip processor if you don't overclock or overclock very mildly. You don't need to spend $50 or $100 on cooling for this level of CPU. Now, if you like the idea of the Hyper 212 Evo, but you have fully embraced the RGB of 2017, not to worry, Cooler Master has you covered. This is brand new. This is effectively a Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo. I know it's not called that, and it's a little bit different, but it's effectively pretty similar. RGB, yay! This also comes with the Ryzen bracket in the box, whereas the Hyper 212 Evo does not. So this is AM4 compatible in the box. It's about $20 more expensive than the Hyper 212 Evo, and it has a better mounting system. I do like how they've reworked the mounting system. It's a little bit easier to install. This is very, very nice. I'll be using this on an upcoming build video. So if you want RGB, get this one. If you don't care about RGB, get the Hyper 212 Evo. But wait, I have one more recommendation for you. The box currently sitting in front of you is the Corsair 120mm H55 silent liquid cooler. It's not actually this is a stand-in because I don't have it in front of me. It's on its way to me. They are sending me one. The new Corsair H50 budget 120mm cooler is under $50. In fact, when I filmed this video with a mail-in rebate, it was way under $50. Again, links to all these will be in the description below, but for an Intel processor, non-K chip, it's all that you need, and you can often find the Corsair 120mm liquid cooler, the H50, for less than the tower coolers. It's very, very cheap. The only conditional statement to the H50 is it's Intel only. Do keep that in mind, but it's got a great, great price. The brackets only work on Intel chips. I will be doing, with the one they're sending me, an i5 build later in the month. So if you want to see that, be sure you're subscribed to my channel so that you can be notified when that comes out. But the fact that a liquid cooler is not only under $50, but comfortably under $50 is really nice. It does make mounting in smaller cases easier as well because the big tower coolers require room and space, and some cases don't fit them too well, whereas a small 120 liquid cooler fits into almost anything. Now that's the Intel non-K chip. Let me talk about the Ryzen 5 1600. The Ryzen 5 1600 comes with the excellent Wraithspire cooler. This is actually made by Cooler Master under license. They provide this to AMD. This is silent. This is powerful. It has a real copper plate on the bottom. It is not a cheap aluminum finned, well, I don't want to say the Intel cooler is cheap, but the Intel cooler is cheap. In fact, if I put them, this weighs nothing. There's nothing to it. There's no mass. There's no metal. There's no copper on the bottom. This is at least 3 times the weight. This is a great cooler. Would I use the Wraithspire cooler? Yes, absolutely. There's really no need to buy a second cooler, and it's included at no extra charge with the 1600. I would absolutely recommend that you overclock a Ryzen 5 1600 to 3.7 gigahertz fixed on all 6 cores using this cooler and be very happy with the performance that you get. For 60 frames per second smooth gaming, that's actually all that you need. Now, you need a decent graphics card. If you want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands at high detail at 1440p, you're going to need a GTX 1070 graphics card, which would be a great match for this CPU because it will handle that just fine. Now, if you want to overclock to 4 gigahertz, this isn't enough. It's close, but it's not. You're really going to run at quite high temperatures trying to use this at 4 gigahertz. Now, for 4 gigahertz, I also recommend that you step up to the 1600X CPU because it's been to run at 4 gigahertz out of the box. Not on all the cores. The X chip runs stock at 3.7 on all 6 cores out of the box, but it will overclock to 4 gigahertz. What would I use on the 1600X chip? Either of the two Cooler Masters I showed you before would be just fine. The Corsair H50 is not compatible with it. The H55 and the H60 with the appropriate bracket are. You can also use the new Master Liquid 120 Lite, which can be found often for around $50 from Cooler Master, and it comes with the AM4 bracket in the box. Please note the Hyper 212 Evo does not include an AM4 bracket in the box. You'll have to order that from Cooler Master. The new RGB one that I showed you before does, but it's a $50 RGB tower cooler, so whether or not that's worth it to you is a personal decision. Would I use anything bigger or fancier on the X chip, such as that Corsair H100i V2 back there? No, there's no point. You're not going to overclock any faster. Your overclocking ability on the Ryzen chips is not generally massively temp limited. Your voltage and just chip design limited. No matter how much cooling you put on these processors, 4 gigahertz is about where the voltage wall is. And even to run at 4 gigahertz, you're probably going to have to put 1.4 volts into it, which is about the limit that I would go to on overclocking. As you go above 4 gigahertz, it just won't go. You have to throw so much voltage at it. The temperature goes crazy. And then eventually the thing just locks up. So with the current generation Ryzen processors, it's pretty much 4 gigahertz is your limit, no matter what cooling you put on it. And to run at 4 gigahertz does not require a 240 or 280 millimeter liquid cooler. It just isn't worth the money. Having said that, Intel absolutely can use the big coolers for the K chip at 5 gigahertz. Now, it's much better than the previous processor. The i7-8700K Kaby Lake, the 7th generation predecessor, it ran hot, and I have big coolers on those, and I've had trouble getting 5 gigahertz stable across the board. Coffee Lake, not so much. Great overclocking. They definitely have made some improvements to the chips to make overclocking much easier. To be completely blunt, if you're spending the money on this K chip and on a $200 Z370 motherboard, which is what I would put the K chip on if I were buying one for me, then the minimum cooler I would consider is either a 240 millimeter liquid cooler or one of the big tower coolers. Liquid cooling first. That Corsair H100i V2 back there would be an excellent choice. That's an updated version with the latest generation of the actual liquid block. It's got the good sleeved cables. It is a very good cooler. Now, if you have room for it, get a 280 millimeter cooler, 36% more cooling area, and that would be the H115i. This is a little bit more expensive than the H100 back there, but the cost difference is minor. You're looking at maybe $30 more expensive, but by the time you put everything into this computer, that's a minor difference. And for 36% more radiator cooling area and larger fans, if your case supports 280 millimeter cooling, skip that and buy this. Now, in fairness, there are certainly other brands of 280 millimeter coolers. I would love to test the NZXT Kraken X62. I don't have one, but from all reports, it's just fine as well. EVGA also makes their CLC 280 cooler, and from the reports that I've read, it's also fine. But this is what I've used, and for 280 millimeter coolers for this kind of build, this would be on my short list. Now, if you would like to save a little bit of money or you don't have room for a 280 millimeter cooler, I have two other choices for you. This is the new Cooler Master Master Liquid 240 millimeter light cooler, $60. That's not with a mail-in rebate. That's the normal price. This is an amazing value for the money. Now, it is missing a couple of the features. It doesn't have the little RGB head. It doesn't have the Corsair link that the H110 back there does. But it's also nearly $50 less expensive, and it has the same surface area and the same fans and basically the same cooling performance as that one back there for less money. Now, would I put this onto an i7-8700K? Yes, if I only had room for a 240 millimeter cooler. If you're okay with Cooler Master, if you're happy with their products, sure. But I have another option for you might want to consider. If you like the look of this, but you're okay to pay a bit more for some shiny, welcome to 2017 RGB. I kid you not. This is under $100 and it is a 240 millimeter full RGB cooler. Look at those fans. This is fancy. Now, if you only have room for a 240 and you want RGB and you want a completely lit up system, put this on your short list. Now, of course, this is liquid coolers. Not everybody wants liquid. Some people want tower cooling. Not a problem. I have tested tower coolers. Let me show you a couple. This is the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 3. It is a $90 tower cooler, and it is one of the nicest coolers I have ever used. The precision machining of the materials, the quality of the metal, the polishing, the base plate, this is very well made. I was in awe when I took it apart and actually looked at it in detail. It's not cheap for a tower cooler. At $90, you can buy the 240 millimeter liquid coolers from Cooler Master for less money. But no liquid, and that's important to some people. Now, be cautioned. This does block one of the RAM slots on the motherboards that I put it on. You really are going to limit yourself to 3 RAM slots with this. It is so big. It's heavy, but it does have a good reinforcing backplate, and frankly, I don't have any worries about that so long as you're not moving your machine around too much. If you build your machine and you put it in one place, this will be just fine. It also cools very, very well. I currently have, this is an empty box at the moment, and the reason this is an empty box is this cooler is currently installed in a Be Quiet case downstairs on an i7-8700K, 5 gigahertz, no issues. Did you watch me live stream and benchmark Star Wars Battlefront 2 on the i7-8700K? See the temperatures? This is the cooler that was on it when I was doing those. It really works very, very well. Now, if for whatever reason you don't want to go with Be Quiet, I would like to point out that the Noctura, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the D15 is going to be very similar to this in terms of cooling performance. That's also $90. And if you want that one instead of this one, then by all means get that. They're both going to be just fine. 5 gigahertz all-core overclocking on this or that would be great. On the other hand, if you want to go completely crazy extreme and you want to go with something that's just a cut above the rest, try this. This is a monster cooler. Yes, this is an air cooler. Look how big this box is. This is a tower cooler. This has a real vapor chamber in it. This is the Cooler Master Master Air Maker 8, and it is a monster cooler. It is over $100. It is actually more expensive than most of the 240 and even some of the 280 millimeter coolers. But if you don't want liquid, but you want the best of the best, take a look at this. And it also has a couple of features that even the Dark Rock Pro 3 and the Noctura do not have. Look for a full review on this in an upcoming video. I will put it on the test bench and show you the difference between it and the other $90 tower coolers. Or for fun, just to see the difference of the box size, I stuck the Dark Rock Pro 3 next to it. Now, there is some foam padding in here to protect it. I mean, it's not quite that large. It is big. You're going to want to check the measurements on this before you consider buying one to make sure it fits within your case. It's not going to fit into all cases, but wow, what a cooler. The only thought I will leave you regarding coolers is by the time you've spent $350 to $400 on a CPU, $200 on this, $700 on a graphics card, a bunch of money on RAM and SSD storage and everything else, $20, $30, $40 price difference for a cooler shouldn't really change your mind. Buy the cooler that you want. Buy this one, or buy a 280, or buy the RGB if you want it. You're not looking at a huge overall price difference for the price of your system once you've stepped up to this level of premium. Now, would I put either of these coolers onto the Ryzen processor? No, you don't need this much cooling. It is complete overkill. For even a Ryzen 7 1800X, it would be complete overkill. Go with the less expensive choices. But for the 8700K at 5 gigahertz, these are worth the money. What about the motherboard choice? Now, you might be surprised to learn this, but I have 1 or 2 Ryzen motherboards, and I've used a variety of these over the summer, and I've reviewed some of them, and others still need a review. Now, let me be completely blunt. There is no performance difference between any of these boards in terms of how well your games or your programs or your multitasking run. The performance is in the processor, your graphics card, your SSD, and your RAM. It is not in the motherboard. The difference between all these motherboards is in features and price, and of course brand preference and style. The difference between, say, a Gigabyte, an MSI, and an ASUS X370 board, which you can see right here, is all style, color, features, etc. And each company makes multiple models within each chipset. Now, in front of me here is the ASUS X370 Prime Pro. Would I put a Ryzen 5 anything on this board? No, I wouldn't. If you're going to spend the money of an X370 board, get a Ryzen 7 1700 or a 1700X. Don't get a Ryzen 5. By the time you've stepped up to these boards, if you want the extra features, the extra ports, the SLI support, the proper Crossfire support, get the Ryzen 7 and be done with it. So we're going to put the X370s aside, and we're only going to talk about the B350s. Unlike Intel, which on their mid-level chipsets does not let you overclock their processors, AMD does. All B350 motherboards will let you overclock all Ryzen processors, even the non-X chips. So if we're just going to talk about B350 boards, which one do you buy? They range in price from about $70 all the way up to about $150. Please don't spend $150 on a B350 board. That would be wasteful. On the other hand, you can get a premium experience in a B350. Some really good examples are the one that's in front of me from ASRock. You can see here this ASUS ROG Strix is a very nice board, and these generally tend to run about $100. And then that MSI there, the Gaming Pro, that is a less expensive board that's often available in the $70 price range. What is the difference between a $100 board and a $70 board? Features, ports. That has 2 memory slots. This has 4. This has more SATA ports, more USB ports, etc. Oftentimes when you spend $100, you get a little bit better voltage regulator for overclocking, better power phases. It usually doesn't matter, especially if you're doing a Ryzen 5 1600 going to 3.7 gigahertz, it makes no difference. All of the boards are going to do that. If you, however, want to go to 4 gigahertz fixed, A, you may need a voltage bump, and B, you might need a little bit better power delivery just because that is more of a push on the Ryzen CPUs. In that case, if you want a Ryzen 5 1600X and you're okay to buy an aftermarket cooler, something like the ASUS ROG Strix B350 would be, in fact, a very nice choice. It is better than, say, the Prime B350 Plus that is beneath it. Likewise with MSI. Would I get the B350 Tomahawk for a X chip at 4.0 gigahertz? No, I wouldn't. Spend something a little bit more like the Gaming Pro Carbon or something like that. You want to buy a little bit further up the line if you're trying to do 4 gigahertz. But I would run a Ryzen 5 1600 at 3.7 on the $70 board without any complaint. And in fact, I have. Most of the benchmark tests you've seen on Ryzen have actually been done on an ASUS B350M Micro ATX $70 motherboard. Not one of the fancy ones, one of the cheap ones. When it comes to motherboards for Intel processors, you currently have one choice, the Z370 chipset. Now, you have many choices within that chipset, but unlike on the Ryzen side, where we have multiple chipsets, in 2017, it's Z370 or bust. Sometime in 2018, we're supposed to be getting lower-end chipsets for the locked processors, probably called the B360 to deal with AMD's B350, and then the H370 is probably what they're going to be called, although that's not confirmed yet. Those will be designed for the non-K chip. So if you're watching this video for whatever reason in February or March of 2018 and there's an H370, well, you might want to consider that for the non-K chip. I first want to talk about the non-K chip with what you can buy today. The most you need to spend on a motherboard for the i7-8700 is something like this killer SLI. This is under $150, but it's still a great board with great features. I've covered this before. The non-K chip, any of the i5s or i3s, even the K chips there would also be fine for this. Great value for the money, a great feature set for under $150. But I wouldn't put the i7-8700K on here. Why? Because by the time you spent that much money on your CPU and cooler and SSD and RAM and everything else, I think the $200 price point is where the sweet spot for 5 gigahertz overclocking is. Let me be clear. This board will overclock to 5 gigahertz. I've had it on my test bench. I tweeted pictures of that on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, you saw those. It does actually run at 5 gigahertz. But I think if you're going to do that, spend $50 more and buy, for example, the Z370 Tai Chi from ASRock if you prefer ASRock boards, because that also runs nicely and it has better power delivery, more features, more phases, and a couple of other things on it that the killer SLI does not. Likewise, The Gaming Ultra from Gigabyte you can see in the stack here also ran at 5 GHz just fine, but I would skip it and get the Gaming 5 or Gaming 7 for the K chip. Get the Gaming Ultra, in my opinion, for the non-K chip or any of the i3 or i5 chips. I mentioned before the Dark Rock Pro 3 from Be Quiet. That cooler is installed on this motherboard. All the launch video benchmarks that were done way back at the beginning of October were done on this board on the K chip with the Dark Rock Pro 3 installed. Easy 5 GHz overclock, no big deal, never goes above 1.4 volts. Frankly, it runs at 1.35 just fine, temps are fine. Very nice board, about $200, very balanced feature set. I will definitely be using this in the future. Now I am grateful to MSI because they sent me that Gaming Pro Carbon for launch. But just to show you that I'm not biased just because I get free samples, this I bought myself, which is why you haven't seen a video on it yet. But this board is what is currently installed on my test bench back there. 5 GHz, easy overclocking, 1.35 volts, using the built-in overclocking profile. Go into the BIOS, come down, choose the overclock 5 GHz, press it, turn XMP on, press F10 to save and reboot. That's it. Nothing else was required. All the benchmarks you've seen in the past 2 weeks, with the exception of 1 or 2 videos which were done on the Gigabyte Gaming 7 board, have been done on this. I had the Gaming 7 on there. In fact, I tweeted pictures of that because it's gorgeous with all the RGB. But both of them, frankly, run at 5 GHz just fine. Now, as I said, I had to buy this board. Would I? Yes, it's $200. It's a great board. BioStar. I did a BioStar B350 in the giveaway 2 months ago. We'll be doing something with this in December. You'll just have to wait and see for it. But I haven't used this yet, but I will. And I'll post on Twitter when I do that. I'll show pictures of it, but I will put this on the test bench and test it as well. If you're going to 5 GHz overclocking and you like Gigabyte and you want RGB, this has more RGB on it than I think I've ever seen on a motherboard in my life. Skip the 5, skip the Ultra, get this. It's currently on sale. It's not that much more expensive. Again, once you've gone top of the line, go top of the line and get the Gaming 7. Very, very nice, totally 100% stable. Frankly, all these boards have been very easy to overclock on both air cooling as well as liquid cooling. I do have to address the elephant in the room, that $500 MSI Godlike Gaming. It is a gorgeous board. I've played around with it a little bit and I love it. That's part of the giveaway that we're doing. Do I wish I could keep it? Yes, I do actually, but I can't because it was sent for the giveaway. Would I spend the $500 that it costs? No. Sorry, MSI. I mean, it's a flagship board. It's for the people who just don't care and just want the best for whatever reason and are not price sensitive. But truthfully, if you have the kind of money where $500 for a motherboard makes sense, why are you on the consumer platform? I would buy an X299 or X399 board and go Skylake X or Threadripper before I would ever spend $500 on a consumer platform. And it pains me to say it because I appreciate MSI sending that. And it is great and amazing. And if you don't care about the price, yes, it's the best Z370 board on the market, full stop, no question whatsoever. The most features, the most everything, every possible thing you can imagine is on that board. But it's $500. I'm sorry, I got to keep it real and say, yeah, that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Not for a 6-core consumer level processor. I love you, MSI. Get the Gaming Pro Carbon if you like them. Earlier when I was talking about CPUs, I didn't mention the FX series of processors much, so I just want to briefly talk about it now. If you are using an older FX 6300 or 8300 or one of those lines of CPUs, is it worth upgrading? Generally, yes. If you're a performance user, if you're either playing modern AAA games, if you're multitasking, doing content creation, yes, the new CPUs are dramatically faster. Just to put a simple point on it, the new i7-8700K is more than twice as fast as an FX 8300. Now, yes, you can overclock this, but that's stock to stock. Overclock to overclock, you may be looking at 2.5 times the performance of the i7-8700K versus the FX 8300. If you want a dramatic, huge performance increase, it's really there. Finally, it is all well and good to talk about the i7-8700K, but on the day that I'm filming this, it's pretty much sold out everywhere. This leaves you 2 choices. Well, 3. One is wait. The second choice is you can buy a pre-built machine from a company like CyberPower, iBuyPower, Falcon Northwest, Origin Systems, etc. Those are boutique custom builders that will build you a machine that includes that chip because they get allocation first. So you can actually buy a custom machine that's pre-built for you with an 8700K. You just can't get the chip itself, at least not from Amazon and Newegg right now. Your third option is to skip Coffee Lake completely and consider going to Skylake X. These motherboards are not that much more expensive than the premium Z370 boards. They are a bit, but this one right here can be had for just over $300. So it's about a $100 price premium for the motherboard. Right now on Newegg, back orders for the i7-8700K are going for $420. I wouldn't pay $420 for it, but if you wanted to order one, you could and they'll deliver it when they get them in. But you can get the 8-core 16-thread i7-7820 Skylake X with 28 PCI Express lanes on a high-end enthusiast desktop platform for only $550. It is currently only $130 more expensive to step up from the 6-core Coffee Lake to the 8-core Skylake X. And you get other things, 28 CPU PCI Express lanes, you get quad-channel RAM, you can put 3 NVMe solid-state drives in here, and they will all run off the CPU. On Coffee Lake, you can put 3 NVMe's on, but they run through the chipset, not the CPU. So if you want a premium high-end experience and you're okay to spend a bit extra money, $300 for a board, $550 for the CPU, 8 cores, 16 threads, and Intel performance. Now, I know some people will counter and say, well, if you want 8 cores, you've got Ryzen. Rest assured, Skylake X is faster than Ryzen, about 25% faster. I've tested that in video encoding. Adobe Premiere Pro H264 4K 60 frame per second video encoding. My Skylake X chip, I have the 8-core chip, is 25% faster than my Ryzen 7 1700 overclocked to 3.8 gigahertz. Now, it is worth noting that the Skylake X costs a lot more than the Ryzen, but it does perform better. If you want higher frame rates, if you want the higher frame rate gaming of Intel, this is an option if you're okay to pay a bit more. I hope this deep look at performance has been helpful and useful to you. Please note that all of my comments here are based upon practical experience. I've had 6 motherboards in the past month on my test bed. I've used these. I've had a half a dozen different Ryzen boards on there in the past 6 months. I've used these chips extensively. My comments regarding coolers are based upon use. So when I give you my opinions and viewpoint, it's based upon putting all the graphics cards on there and trying different things at different resolutions. I realize there's no benchmark test in here, but I hope that the 800 plus videos that I've posted in the past 18 months on YouTube and all the benchmarks and testings that I've done will lend you to sort of give me the benefit of the doubt when I do this. As I said, I have not done with my current method of testing the Ryzen 5 1600 and 1600X. Those will come maybe later this month, maybe sometime in December, but until those do, I hope this is useful and informative, especially when it comes to coolers, motherboards, etc. As always, everything I mentioned will be linked in the description below. If this video was helpful and useful to you, use those links. It really does make a difference. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to the big huge button directly below. Remember to enter the giveaway if you're watching this in November of 2017. Giveaway link down in the video description below to enter to win one of 4 great prizes, including a brand new i7-8700K gaming machine. Awesome. With that $500 motherboard even, that's where that's going. Remember to like, comment, and of course, follow me on Twitch, Twitter, and support me on Patreon if you're able. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.